So, peppered moths. This was a famous study done in England. It was really popular in the 1800s, actually, to observe moths and to just go like kind of like bird watching, moth watching. It's kind of strange, but it was very well observed that there were dark and light variants in the 1800s, and they look like that. And that's against a green background. Against a dark background, they look like that. Um, some data that we have about them are recorded 1848, 5% dark but 95% light colored. So most of them were this color. And just a few were this color. 1895, it had completely flip-flopped. 98% were dark but 2% were light. By 1995, it had gone back the other way. So 19%, so still a higher percentage, but it had gone down. So the selection factor here was that in the early 1800s, this was pre-industrial England, where you had very low population and lots of lichen growing on trees. And lichen is a white gray sort of stuff, you know.
It's not a fungus, but it's like
it grows on rocks and trees and stuff, and it looks like light colored bark, sort of. So yeah, looks like that. And then the late 1800s was when the Industrial Revolution started pumping a lot of soot into the air, and so the trees were coated with this really dark soot, and it killed off the lichen and it made the bark dark colored. By the mid-1900s, we had achieved some pollution control laws that saw the return of the lichen and the return of the light-colored bark, and so we saw the population kind of bounce back to where it was. And this is called industrial melanism, and melanism just refers to the pigment color, and industrial is obvious. And the industrial melanism is just defined as this phenomenon in which darker colored individuals come to predominate over the lighter ones. And other moths in other industrialized areas showed the same trend to darken, so it wasn't an isolated incident. The pollution control resulted in bark color being lighter again. So that was a good thing. The light-colored peppered moths are now dominant in the population, and this is used as a really classic example of natural selection in action.
The golfers should be returning to class as the meet was postponed.
Okay. So artificial selection then is the next place that we're going to go with this. This was something that Darwin himself really worked on a lot, and he was involved in pigeons. He did racing pigeons, and he did other things with plants and stuff. So we'll kind of look at that a little bit. Artificial selection has been happening for a long time, and corn is a very, very good example of artificial selection. This is the original grass that corn comes from. It's called teosinte, and it's much, much smaller. You can see this is the same quarter as the corn. These little pieces are tinier. But over time, native populations in the Americas selected the teosinte that had larger and larger kernels, larger and larger quantity of kernels, and so this is where we got modern corn. And this has been studied a lot. There are really only about 5 gene differences between teosinte and corn, so you can actually genetically engineer it backwards too, which is kind of interesting. This is change initiated completely by humans. There are lots more examples. Here are the few little genes that are involved in the teosinte. When they pick a phenotypic trait that they want, they pick only individuals with it and reproduce just that, just like we did with our plants, which are growing seeds, which is kind of neat. So the genes for the flowers are located in one spot on the chromosome, and the branch pattern is located on one, and the open seeds like on the corn are located on one. So really they just have to pick individuals that are strong in those particular genes, and there's really very little difference between the two plants. So we go from teosinte to something a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger. So this directional selection should result in evolutionary change. And when we say it results in evolutionary change, what they mean is that natural selection alone is not evolution. Natural selection is obvious. We can do natural selection. We can make it work. But what is the point at which you go from natural selection to actually evolution? And that's something that's still kind of debated and studied a lot, but we can see that happening too. In experimental selection is another kind of the same sort of idea, but we're looking at flies and other choice animals to see where we can change them and alter their distribution of certain traits. So in this experiment, we're looking at fly butts, and they selected fruit flies that had lots of bristles on the abdomen, kind of like our hairy flowers. At start, the average number of bristles was 9.5, and then they chose to breed together only the ones with the most bristles. After 86 generations, the average number of bristles went from 9.5 to 40. And so in looking at this, we say, okay, well, can you really change a population through natural selection? And the answer appears to be yes. We can go from an average of 8.5 and actually push that number up and up and up. So we're not bounded by this, 8.5, the high number and the low number there. We can actually push it away from where the means are. So you've got this, low population, initial population, where you can push it downward and you can push it upward, and it can change population. Other factors to consider with humans and artificial selection is that you can sometimes get unintended consequences, like the attempt to domesticate silver foxes. This was done in like the 40s or something. I forget, maybe later than that. But silver foxes, they chose the most docile or the tamest foxes to breed together, and within 40 years they basically became domesticated dogs. They weren't foxes anymore. They had just the same traits as dogs because they're closely related. And so our traits for behavior linked to other traits are behavior linked genetically to things. Pleiotropy, where more than one gene is kind of linked with other genes that make the fox kind of, when you're looking for the same traits, makes it become like a dog. So it's kind of an interesting little study there. Well, it wasn't a study, it was kind of more of just an experiment to see if they could get domesticated foxes. So can you produce major evolutionary changes through simple natural selection? And evidence suggests that yes, that natural selection is the process responsible for the fossil record changes that we see over time. Critics of evolution often say, well, yeah, natural selection is a no-brainer. But can it actually lead to speciation? Substantial changes in the fossil record where you get a whole new species. And the argument there doesn't really fully take into account the changes that get produced by artificial selection. Partly, we don't think of this now, but dog breeds can reproduce together so they're the same species, but we don't know what could do that in some of the cases in the fossil record. We don't know if everything, some things that we find as fossils might have been just variations of the same species. Okay, so domestication of dogs and domestication of cats and things is kind of human-imposed selection, and we've done that with pigeons, cats, dogs, lots of plants, corn, wheat is a big one. We've messed around a lot with wheat. And so you've got some breeds that might have had a specific purpose, but they all came from the wolf. All of them are very, very closely related to the wolf and to each other. And this is an interesting picture because it shows the body similarities really well, I think, in some of these. Just some of it's just as simple as size and ear shape, and then you're back to the same thing. Okay, so that's artificial selection is definitely a form of evidence for evolution, as is the fossil record itself. So the types of evidence that we're going to look at in this chapter that you guys probably already looked at when you did the review was the fossil record and transition species, the anatomical record, which is homologous and vestigial structures, embryology and development, analogous structures is in there too. The molecular record, which is protein and DNA sequencing, genome sequencing, lots of that going on. And then what we just talked about, artificial selection, which is human-caused evolution. So we'll go through each of these really briefly. I'll try to keep it short and rushed because you guys have already done the review on it. So the layers of the fossil record are made of sedimentary rock. Other kind of rock would get hot and put too much pressure on the fossils and they would get destroyed and melt them down. So as the new layers of sedimentary rock cover the old ones, we can create a record where the older rocks are on the bottom and the newer ones are on the top. Fossils within layers show that the organisms have populated Earth through a long period of time. All of these layers have fossils in these different organisms. And anywhere, have you ever been driving like on a road where you go past a mountain and there's a big rock cut? Rock cuts are really good places to hunt fossils because you can just go in and start digging and you can see the lower layers, and it's really interesting. So this is a picture of a trilobite. Trilobites are very numerous fossils. They're kind of neat. There's a few other examples of fossils. Human ancestor fossils, petrified wood, amber that preserves insects, leaves that make leaf prints, and this is an ammonite. Ammonites can be really big or really small. This is a dinosaur bone. It's kind of neat. So what the fossil record is, it's just simply a record that shows today's organisms descending from an ancestral species. So it's the record of all the fossils and things that the animals left behind in rock. So this one's a kind of a neat picture because it has the modern African and Asian elephants, and then the mammoths, and then it shows these earlier fossils that we found, the stegodon, and I don't know how to say this one, platybiodon probably, mastodons and dinotheriums, and then earlier on barotheriums and moratherium. And then, you know, they're all related. There is some efforts still to try to bring back the mammoth, which is kind of interesting. I don't know how successful they'll be at that, but this one's of horses. And horses kind of show an interesting evolution. They started really small. They were tiny little things, and they had toes. They had like 5 toes, and they were 25 million years ago or so. They were in, let's see here, right here, North America. They were really widespread, and they had molars so they could eat grass. Their hoofs, they transformed to become faster on grass. And so that's kind of, this was probably partly some human interference too in domesticating, because that's about this, well, not that long ago. Up in here, there's a lot of human interference. But yeah, the little hoofs, this goes from this to what we have now, which is that. So, it's kind of interesting. Other interesting and important fossils include Archaeopteryx. This guy is important because he has feathers. And this is kind of what prompted the understanding of the avian nature of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs really are just big birds. And one of the descendants that we see now that we don't really think a lot about is the chicken. The chicken is a really closely, in some ways, really closely related to dinosaurs. So Archaeopteryx, the earliest known flying bird from late Jurassic period, exhibits lots of primitive characteristics with dinosaurs and shows a lot of bird characteristics also, like wings and feathers. And they probably think it could fly a little bit. Well, no, initially they thought that it could only fly a little bit, but now they think it could fly a little bit more than they thought initially. So that's Archaeopteryx. 150 million years ago, that's kind of a drawing of what they said it looked like. This specific fossil is replicated a lot. The original's in the Smithsonian. So they think it was flying, obviously. Okay, and so this is an example of what we would call a transitional fossil. And a transitional fossil, something in between, obviously dinosaurs in this case and birds. A transitional fossil, something that has characteristics of both. For a long time, this was something that evolution opponents really, really harped on. This one was found in 2004. Prior to that time, there weren't all that many transitional fossils, and so it was something that was kind of made fun of in comics like this, where you had, our modern, I can't tell if that's, yeah, our modern whales, and then backing up, we had these fossils of older things that seemed related, but we didn't necessarily have a step-by-step. And so people harped on this a lot, saying, where are the transitional fossils? And there were a lot of comics that made fun of it for a long time. And then, all of a sudden, we actually found the transitional fossils, starting in about 2004 and later. All of these are fossils we have. We have Pakicetus and Ambulocetus, Dalanistes, Rhodocetus, Tetracellus, and I can't read that one, Gaviocetus, Donodon. We have all of these as samples. A lot of them were found in the same area of the Indus River Valley in Pakistan. So it's 4 or 5 different intermediate forms just found in the last 20 years. So the comics have really started to disappear. And one of the big intermediates that was found is called Tiktaalik. And Tiktaalik was found in 2006 in the Arctic Circle, Ellesmere Island specifically. And this is what they found, several pieces. This is the very best one. This is actually just a cast of it. But it's a missing link between fish that walked on land or fish that were in the water and fish that ended up walking on land and becoming amphibians. Yeah. Yeah, and part of the way that they know this is because the fish, even now, their fins don't have like 5 fingers and these sort of phalanges bones. But all land animals do. All of them. All land vertebrates have these where you've got one bone in your, one bone in your upper arm, 2 bones in your lower arm, and all of your lots of digits. Okay, so all walking land mammals have this, and so they were kind of actively looking for a transitional fossil that had the precursors of the digits right in here. And he does have, he's got the 1 bone, 2 bone, many bones pattern, and he was really fin-like fish, and they've got the whole fossil. And so really, really interesting and important piece. They looked specifically for it in the search for this fossil. They were looking in specific places, and they were looking for specific things, and they found it. So paleontology is more targeted than just serendipitous sometimes. This is a picture of the modern whale versus Rhodocetus castrani. It was a transitional fossil too. It had reduced limbs. It couldn't walk or swim, but it had this up and down sort of motion like modern whales, and we can see that it was kind of a precursor there. And again, what's interesting about whales is if you kind of look back over here, it came from a land mammal. And so whales have that 1 bone, 2 bones, many bone pattern. And so that distinguishes them from being more related to fish than we are. We have a common ancestor with whales. These are a couple more. Ambulocetus natans probably walked on land like modern sea lions, swam by flexing backbone and paddling with hind limbs. Pakicetus lived on land, but its skull was different from its ancestors. Over time, they were venturing into the water, and they evolved the ability to blow through the top of their head. And these changes were starting to be seen. That's partly what equates them with whales. So those are some transitional fossil examples. Okay. 2.1.5. Anatomical evidence. Different ways that evolutionists look at this is, and one of them, it's a very strong argument for evolution, is that organisms are not perfectly adapted to their environment. They have really workable but sometimes very imperfect and even flawed solutions to things. Well, for example, most animals with very long necks simply have many vertebrae for flexibility. The geese have 25, Pliosauruses have 76, mammals have 7, but there are still long-necked mammals. And if we look at this having many vertebrae as a requirement for having a long flexible neck, well then the giraffe is fail on that because it only has 7. So the 7 vertebrae are really, really big because it makes up for the length of the neck. It's not a perfectly engineered system. It's simply nature working with what it has. So evidence that if it were trying to be engineered perfectly, it would have more vertebrae. But it's not engineered perfectly. We're working with what we have. Eyes are another big thing that evolutionists look at to kind of say that we're imperfectly designed. Our photoreceptors are facing backward, and I'm probably not going to explain this very well because my understanding of it's kind of old, gotten a little rusty, but the photoreceptors of our eyes face backwards. Our nerve fibers are slightly obscuring the light, and we have a blind spot right back here. So our blind spot keeps us from seeing certain things. Mollusks' eyes actually are better designed with no obstruction and no blind spot, but we don't have mollusk eyes. We have human eyes. So if we were designed the way that we are, you'd think we could have done a little bit better. But we're not. So homologous structures, another thing that we look at is simply what I was talking about here before, the one bone, two bone, many bones, is showing a wide variety of all land animals that have this one bone, two bone, many bone situation. Shows that we had a common ancestry. They're in all kinds of things. All right. Homologous structures are ones that have a similar structure, similar development, but very different functions. So just like the one bone, two bone, many bones things, all of the human hand, the feline limbs, the bat wings, I don't even know what that is, and the whale fins all have a very, very similar structure. So it shows a recent common ancestor, not just an ancestor, but a recent common one. Other examples, leaves and needles have commonalities with their structures, and you can see kind of what that comes from, but they have different related structures, but different. Same deals with these. Succulent leaves are different, and there's all kinds of variations on these needles of different things. So those are homologous structures. Lots of examples. All right, fun stuff. Another one is comparative embryology, which is where we get embryos that are similar in development, but they're very close, but they have really, really, really strong similarities even amongst different species. All vertebrate embryos have some things in common. Structures at different stages of development. Gill pouches in fish, frog, snake, birds, and humans. And they develop into different things, but early on they're highlighted in blue here. They're all the same. And vestigial organs are another one. Modern animals have structures that don't serve any function at all. We have a tailbone, but we don't have a tail. We have an appendix that has no use whatsoever. Remnants of structures that were functional anciently but are not anymore are evidence that we're not designed the way that we are in our modern form. Deleterious mutations are ones that would be useless. They would accumulate in genes for non-critical structures without reducing fitness. So there's just stuff that stays around without any reason for it to be removed. So this one is the blind cavefish of Mexico. They actually do have eyes. They don't need them. They don't use them. They're completely blind, but they're there. So it's not the same as Lamarck's loss from disuse. It's just that we've got these mutations I kind of said that wrong. Deleterious mutations, meaning that mutations that get rid of this accumulate in the genes because they're not used, if that makes any sense. I said that kind of backwards. Snakes and whales have their remains of their pelvis and leg bones from walking ancestors. Their mutations, making them smaller and smaller, were just accumulating because they weren't being used. The island-black cavefish, the human tailbone. There's the hind leg bones on the fossil whale. So why would whale bones have pelvis and leg bones if they were always sea creatures? The answer to that is that they were not always sea creatures. Okay. I think that's enough for today.